contains scenes which some viewers may find disturbing.
April 1944. In the South Pacific, an American submarine considers a deadly showdown with an enemy warship. A Japanese destroyer closes in on USS Harder. Skipper Sam Dealey must choose to dive or fight.
Normally, submarines avoid destroyers and other escorts because they're designed to kill submarines. By taking on a destroyer one-on-one, you are, in fact, taking on the toughest game.
With the Japanese still occupying great swaths of the Pacific, the Allies use submarines to subvert their control. Dealey proves relentless in bold attacks during daring patrols, leading USS Harder and its crew into glory and peril. In World War II, subsea weapon allows warriors to fight from beneath the waves. With cunning, force, and tenacity, their enemies strike back. Revolutionary, but still sometimes primitive, it's a desperate bid to change the course of war. Their stories are legend. On April 13th, 1944, Commander Sam Dealey and his crew face a Japanese destroyer in the South Pacific. In 3 war patrols, they have already sunk 10 Japanese merchant ships, but they have never beaten a destroyer, a type of warship that carries depth charges.
Depth charges are cylindrical canisters about 2.5 feet. They're triggered by an orifice that allows seawater to come in, so that when a certain amount of seawater actually gets in, it triggers the depth charge to explode.
Packed with up to 325 pounds of explosives, they're rigged to sink submarines. Just before 7 p.m., Dealey decides to attack instead of evade the destroyer.
Ready, tube 2. 2 ready. Fire tube. 2 on the way.
At some point, he realized that when he was being pursued by destroyers, instead of waiting for them to depth charge him, he could shoot back.
Stand by 3. Fire 3. 3 on the way.
A bubble trail from Dealey's steam-powered torpedoes will give away Harder's location.
Fire 4.
If the offensive
4 on
fails,
the way.
the destroyer will know exactly where to find them. Harder's skipper sinks the escort before it can drop a single bomb. More than 2 years into the Pacific War, only 14 Japanese destroyers have been sunk by American submarines. Dealey joins an elite group of submarine officers daring enough to accomplish this exclusive feat. The success emboldens him.
Commander Sam Dealey is a calm, professional, and reserved naval officer. However, in the heat of a battle, he turns out to be very, very aggressive in a way that many had not foreseen.
The 37-year-old Dealey has commanded USS Harder since it was commissioned in 1942. The soft-spoken skipper comes from an upper-crust Texas family.
Usually officers from those kind of families didn't go to submarines. Submarines were associated with a career path in the Navy that really didn't go very far. Like aviation in the interwar years, it was seen as a negative. So for him to take that path says a lot about him as an individual.
You have to understand, there are people that you would meet that would seem to be the quietest, cautious types. Then you find out they were completely crazy, and they would do things that would be absolutely terrifying.
For Dealey, the easy solution isn't necessarily the best solution. Could he back out of an attack? Yes. However, it would also go against his nature.
Dealey and the crew of USS Harder end their patrol in Fremantle, Australia. Fremantle became an Allied subbase after another Japanese assault only 2 months after Pearl Harbor. In February 1942, the island of Java fell in a fiery campaign and sent the Americans stationed there into a panicked retreat. They scuttled military assets like the warship USS Stewart, dry docked for repairs when the Japanese struck. The destroyer fell into enemy hands. The Japanese Empire reaches a zenith.
Stretched out over about 20 million square miles in 7 time zones. So it's huge. It's held together over millions of miles of sea lanes and open ocean. They were an island nation who depended on this maritime highway to move all their goods around. They had to import almost everything they needed, including rice. And that was especially acute when it came down to war materials, particularly oil, which is the precious fuel source for battleships, bombers, fighters, everything.
The massive but far-flung empire is also a weakness. In early 1944, American submarines in Australia are commanded by Rear Admiral Ralph Waldo Christie. Christie's silent hunters target Japanese ships hauling goods to sustain the Pacific War. Allied operatives planted throughout the Japanese Empire spy on shipping and collect intelligence that helps Christie assign his submarines.
The advantages of having agents ashore were enormous. The Australians had coast watchers. The Japanese would steam down the coast and they would report it.
By May 1944, one of these operations takes an alarming turn. Australian commandos spying in occupied Borneo are betrayed to Japan's infamous military police, the Kempei Tai. 3 have already been captured. 6 more hide in the northern jungles, hunted by hundreds of troops. Australian Special Forces request assistance to recover the commandos, now running low on supplies. The plan requires a submarine to sneak into enemy waters and rescue the operatives before the Japanese find them. Harder's 5th Patrol will include an attempt to rescue the Australian commandos. The jungles of Borneo lie thousands of miles north of Fremantle. Harder's Gato-class build is engineered to make the long-distance run.
It's got the ability to go huge distances, be on patrol for a couple months, and then come back. It could carry a fairly hefty load of torpedoes and also the food and logistics that you need to keep a crew going for that length of time.
Before Harder leaves Fremantle, Dealey welcomes a special passenger. Australian operative, Major Bill Jenkins. Already an escaped prisoner of war, he's committed to defeating the Japanese. His first step is to coordinate the rescue of his besieged comrades. The assignment will not be Jenkins' first mission aboard a submarine.
It takes a little bit of a different type to go into the submarine service. You know, it's a very austere environment. You're living on top of men in bunks. You can go weeks, even months, without seeing daylight.
A submarine can be extremely bizarre for most people, creepy for others. The hull, of course, as it's diving, is going to creak and stress under pressure. But you also have the sound of water rushing into the ballast tanks on both sides, air rushing out. You have the bow going down and the stern going up. It's a bizarre feeling.
With the confined space and eeriness of the submerged environment, Jenkins signs on for all of the risks of a submarine on active patrol. In addition to the rescue attempt, the sub will continue with its regular operations. 22% of America's silent service are killed at sea, the highest casualty rate of any arm of the U.S. military. Even if the rescue is a success, it may only take the commandos out of the jungle and put them squarely in the line of fire. On May 26, 1944, USS Harder leaves Fremantle, Australia. Among the personnel now aboard is Australian operative Bill Jenkins. He quickly volunteers to stand watch on the deck and becomes an accepted member of the crew. They enjoy their share of creature comforts. American submarines boast air conditioning, a critical perk in the heat and humidity of the South Pacific.
You're in a submarine, and you're there for 75 days. How well you feel determines how well you'll fight. A lot of things that feel like luxuries really are things that make it better for you to fight in the end.
Dealey's earlier defeat of a Japanese destroyer proved he can be aggressive. But this mission will also require stealth. The waters that surround northern Borneo are guarded by one of Japan's largest naval bases, Tawi. Harder patrols alone, with only 24 torpedoes. In 1944, it takes American skippers an average of 10 torpedoes to sink one ship. Against a single destroyer, Dealey stood a chance. Against a fleet of warships, aggression would be suicide. Just after 6:30 p.m., the crew spots the first threat to their mission. 3 tankers head to a port on the east coast of Borneo to pick up fuel. They're escorted by 2 Japanese destroyers. Quick and highly maneuverable, Japan relies on these escorts and their underwater bombs to protect against enemy submarines.
Submarines are uniquely vulnerable to attacks. Not only are they at risk of damage, for instance, from a depth charge, but of all that pressure from the seawater pushing in on them can lead to collapses.
The problem with the Japanese was that they didn't know the depths of where the American submarines were. So they generally assumed it is shallow. And so they would set their depth charges to hit rather high in the water,
triggering their underwater bombs to explode at around 150 feet.
The American submarine captains knew this, and so they would dive under and be safe.
That advantage was shattered 19 months into the war, when American Congressman Andrew Jackson May held a press conference.
Unfortunately, a U.S. politician who came back from the Far East boasted that our submarines were safe because the Japanese depth charges were set too shallow. This was not really helpful, and the Navy was furious.
The Japanese picked this information up and quickly retooled their depth charges so that it would go down farther, and as a result, a number of American submarines were sunk.
So by June of 1944, Dealey risks deep-set depth charges every time he evades his Gato-class submarine.
The Gato-class by 1944 isn't obsolete. However, it is not as up-to-date as the Palau-class. For the Gato-class, with a maximum dive depth of about 300 to 350 feet, they don't have that extra 100 feet of depth to be able to maneuver in. It also means they're more likely to be detected and caught.
At 9:25 p.m., one of 2 destroyers escorting the 3-tanker convoy spots USS Harder on the surface. The warship is the Minetsuki, a Mitsuki-class destroyer. Designed to travel at up to 37 knots, the escort can speed nearly twice as fast as Dealey's submarine, even on the surface. Dealey tries outrunning it, but Harder's phosphorescent wake illuminates a path to their position. Dealey drops to periscope depth to hide from the escort. But sharp-eyed lookouts track the periscope's wake. The destroyer turns to intercept USS Harder. It's 1,100 yards away and closing.
With a submarine, your only protection is your invisibility. The cloak of invisibility, if you like. As long as that works, you're okay. If they can see you, you're dead.
Dealey's only chance to thwart the escort's depth charges is to attack first.
Speed, 34 knots.
Speed, 34 knots.
Driven by his earlier success, he prepares to attack an enemy destroyer again. Dealey orders full rudder port, or left, towards the destroyer's profile.
Fire.
Fires 3 torpedoes to target the widest area of the ship possible. If they miss, Dealey will have to dive to avoid the rain of depth charges. Dealey's torpedoes close in. One strikes its bow. A second breaks the ship's spine. Depth charges on the deck explode in the flames. Less than a minute after the torpedoes strike, the destroyer starts to list. Dealey brings the sub to the surface, about 1,000 yards away to confirm the kill. He invites Jenkins and other crew to the bridge to watch. The Minitsuki and its depth charges slip beneath the waves. Dealey has sunk the second destroyer of his career.
Dealey's contribution is to go after destroyers and show it can work. And he sinks a lot of destroyers that way. Not only does he sink a lot of them, but he probably inspires his fellow officers to think this is not a bad idea. That's what Sam Dealey does, and very successfully.
Despite the commandos awaiting rescue, Dealey is not finished with the convoy. Within minutes, the sub detects another ship, only 1,400 yards away. USS Harder is forced to dive again. June 6, 1944, France. The Allies land on the beaches of Normandy, hoping to turn the tide of the European war. In the Pacific, an American submarine has just sunk a Japanese destroyer near northern Borneo, and now pursues the convoy it guarded. A second destroyer prowls near Japan's naval base Tawi Tawi, seeking revenge on the American sub. Using active sonar, the destroyer sends pings of high-frequency sound into the ocean. If the Japanese crew hear the echo bounce off the submarine, they can estimate its location and relative distance. When the enemy ship is close enough, the sound even penetrates the hull of the sub. USS Harder's Hunter is almost certainly an Akazuki-class destroyer, the apex of Japan's World War II escort design. The Akazukis carry up to 72 depth charges to kill submarines. Dealey works the attack periscope in a bid to take the offensive. But intermittent clouds block the moonlight and help cloak his target. As the destroyer approaches head-on, Harder does not have the advantage of attacking the broadside. Dealey must target the bow, which is only 1/10 as wide.
It's a down-the-throat shot. He's heading right for our scope. Standby tube. Fire tube. 2 on the way.
He fires 6 torpedoes. Gambling 1 will strike the escort head-on.
This is before homing torpedoes. He's just firing a bullet, basically, at this narrow thing coming at him.
But this time, Dealey's aggressive gamble fails. All 6 of his torpedoes miss.
Take her deep. Rig for depth charge.
Harder's skipper has run out of offensive choices. He moves quickly to the defense. As the submarine plunges, the crew can only wait for the enemy's depth charges to begin detonating.
You have to imagine the worst possible experience. The sound of the depth charge reverberating through the water. The shock impact on the hull, the shaking of the hull, and what that does inside the hull is absolutely terrifying. You're inundated with noise, you're inundated with the feeling of motion, random motion, but also with anything in the compartment flying around and potentially hitting you. Darkness, because light bulbs tend to burst. It's pretty horrendous.
Harder races to its maximum depth to outrun the destroyer's barrage. As the dive nears 300 feet, the crew expects the submarine to level off. The goal is to equalize Harder's buoyancy with water, then level it with its stern planes, a pair of rudders that control the angle of the submarine. But in the control room,
a very green planesman. He is in the stern plane position, so he's controlling the planes at the back of the boat. He pushed the plane in the wrong direction. He raises the stern of the submarine, in essence driving the boat deeper. A mistake, very human mistake. Under the stress of combat, the sound of depth charges, all of that, human mistake, extremely dangerous.
People on subs being trained, one of the things that they have to learn is what is and is not dangerous. People who are completely new don't get it. They don't get it until they've experienced it.
You're now pushing the submarine closer to crush depth. If you don't recover fast enough, you could lose the submarine.
The diving officer rushes to correct the mistake. Non-essential crew charge to the rear of the submarine to manually redistribute the weight in a desperate bid to bring the bow out of its dive. They managed to level the sub. But the uncontrolled descent has caused another problem. One of the torpedoes in the tubes has started a hot run. Its propeller spins as if it's been launched.
The other torpedo is sitting in the tube. The torpedo gets shaken enough that it starts up. That's very dangerous.
If it keeps spinning, Dealey's submarine could be sunk by its own warhead. In the South Pacific, a World War II submarine is under siege. A Japanese destroyer launches underwater bombs at USS Harder. A hot-run torpedo complicates the crew's plight.
A torpedo hot run is when a torpedo shifts in the tube and causes the propulsion sequence to start, whereby the engine of the torpedo is actually run up and the propellers are actually turning in the tube.
The sound makes it even more unnerving. Dealey and his American crew are in the depths of chaos. lucky this time. It winds down before the warhead overheats or explodes. At that depth, everyone would have perished, and their fates remain an unsolved mystery. About an hour into the onslaught, the ocean finally falls silent. Harder has endured a depth charge attack by Japan's greatest destroyer class. But the clock is ticking for Commander Dealey and Major Jenkins to rescue 6 Allied operatives, a key objective of their patrol.
The commandos in Borneo in 1944, running low on food and supplies, they're being hunted by the Japanese in extremely harsh conditions. They really need to be pulled out, and every attempt at that point had failed. So for the Harder to go in for them, it was extremely important. Those guys needed help.
Dealey and the crew set course for Borneo and finalized plans for the rescue.
In the case of Dealey, he's taking a submarine right up to the shoreline, so he's making himself very vulnerable from shore fire. But he's also putting himself in a position, if a destroyer comes along or another craft can identify him, of not being able to escape because there's no water under the keel to dive, no ability to maneuver.
After dark on June 8, 1944, Harder surfaces and heads towards shore. Some 6,000 yards out, they scrape bottom. It's as close as they can get to the rendezvous point on the north coast. Japanese outposts threaten the submarine on both sides.
Special operations tend to be dangerous because you have to go inshore. If someone spots you, you may be attacked before you can get away.
The crew assists Jenkins and his partner to get their collapsible boats and gear to the deck. They have 3 days' worth of rations should they need to remain ashore to locate the commandos. This would be a worst-case scenario.
When Dealey brings his submarine to the surface to make the rescue in Borneo, he's bathed in moonlight, he's very visible, it's far more light than he'd like to have, and he's very close to the shoreline to do the rescue. So he's also now open to anybody on shore who's got small arms and munitions. So he could be shot at by artillery, machine guns, even rifles. Not a good position to be in.
The rescue team stays in contact with the USS Harder through a series of light signals to assist them with their bearings. As they near shore, they use another light flash to alert the commandos.
Communication with those people to be rescued is essential, and the only way to do that's going to be blinker light. However, anyone on shore can see it, and the blinker light in return from shore is just as visible. So anybody behind the submarine could potentially see that too.
They can only hope no one else is watching. Just after 1 a.m., the operatives signal as they approach the darkened sub.
All right, I see him. Let's get him the sub.
They pull alongside USS Harder. The commandos and their rescuers are hauled aboard, mentally and physically exhausted.
Good job.
Dealey's crew springs to action. Gently backing away from shore and out of shallow water, USS Harder leaves the enemy behind. Below deck, the rescued operatives receive clean clothes and their first real food in months. The cook whips up a celebratory meal of steak and eggs.
For those living on short rations, steak and eggs for breakfast is a massive morale boost. They've been under stress and strain for so long, and then they're greeted with really a hearty breakfast, the first real good food they've had in a long time. You can imagine the feeling in that crew. as they were being rescued.
Food on the U.S. boats was considered among the best.
And other navies would sometimes say things like, well, the Americans are just soft. Well, no, we did very well. Quality of life is what it's called now. We understood that before World War II.
As the commandos turn in, Commander Dealey must turn his attention to a new directive. Allied intel has revealed that Japanese are mobilizing warships at Tawi. The enemy naval base the crew of USS Harder barely survived just days ago. Military brass believe it may be the sign of an epic enemy offensive. Japan's new battle plan, Operation Eiko, orders a consolidated attack to halt advancing American carriers and protect Japanese gains.
The question was, are they doing it? One of the better sources of information would be if you actually saw what was happening in their ports. That's why you send in a sub. You have to see. This is the world before satellites and very long-range reconnaissance planes and all the things that enable you to see what's inside a harbor now on Google on your computer. A submarine is a very good way of finding out. That's why he goes in there.
The U.S. Navy needs this information before Dealey takes the rescued operatives home. Just 4 hours from the shores of Borneo, Dealey and his crew spot evidence of the military buildup. A Japanese warplane patrolling north of the Sabutu Pass also sees them. Planes armed with depth charges are a submarine's deadliest threat.
When there are airplanes, you'd rather dive because first, the airplane can bomb you, but second, he can call in people to go after you. Your job is to disappear.
As Harder reaches 75 feet, an aerial depth charge detonates off the port side. The explosion throws the submarine starboard. The rescued commandos get a rude awakening.
You can have these moments of total boredom when you're laying on your bunk and you're just hanging out, and then you can have at the same point absolute terror when you may still be laying on that same bunk and you've got lights exploding around you, gauges being destroyed. And so from a psychological standpoint, where you feel safe in your bunk can also be where you feel terrified.
Harder withstands the aerial depth charges, but the warplane will probably report the coordinates to Japan's nearby fleet.
New heading, come about, 020 degrees.
Dealey needs to keep his head down. On June 10th, Harder nears the base at Tawi. It will be a perilous prowl. He must remain submerged to conceal his presence, but shallow enough to use his periscope, only about 55 feet below the surface. At 5 p.m., the crew picks up the sound of approaching ships. Dealey raises the periscope for visual corroboration. 2 battleships and at least 4 cruisers steam the waters near Tawi. 8 destroyers and airplanes provide additional coverage. The fleet of warships confirms that Japan's Navy is mobilizing. But before Dealey can report the high-profile sighting, a patrol plane detects Harder through the glassy waters. The aerial scout divulges Dealey's presence to the warships. 2 of the fleet's destroyers turn on the submarine.
Battle stations.
targets the first escort, 1,500 yards from Harda's bow.
Fire tube 2.
He fires a spread of 3 torpedoes. As the other destroyer advances from the starboard side, Dealey is out of time.
Take her deep. Rig for depth charge.
He dives to avoid the second incoming ship. The sub is rocked as explosions detonate. The impact tosses the crew and breaks water lines. As the sea goes silent, the real hunt begins. June 1944. An American submarine attempted to perform reconnaissance of a Japanese naval base in the southern Philippines. Now 2 destroyers stalk USS Harder. The Japanese crews used 2 types of sonar. The passive sonar team listens for any man-made sound beneath the waves.
One way to detect a sub is to listen for it. If you believe that they're chasing you, you'll try to cut off every bit of sound you can so that they won't notice you.
Dealey takes Harder deep in a bid to escape the destroyers. He might also rig for silent running.
Silent running is the procedure whereby you reduce all noise in the submarine by switching off anything that makes a noise unless it's essential for the operation of the submarine.
But no matter how quiet they are, USS Harder remains vulnerable to the destroyer's active sonar pings. If an echo returns to the listening crews, they will hone in on the location. Rig to roll depth charges off the stern and launch them from the sides. The 2 destroyers strategize where Harder may be and lay down a carpet of underwater bombs.
To make depth charging work, you have to visualize how to maneuver the stern of your ship over where you think the submarine will be. You can watch him on your sonar while you con someone else to drop depth charges over him. That's called a creeping attack.
A strike within 50 feet could breach the hull.
So the idea is that you create a barrage of these things. If you do a maneuver just right, you may be able to launch enough depth charges to make a pattern that will enclose the sub. If it's exploded a certain distance from your sub, it'll open it up and that's it.
Dealey's submarine is trapped in the heart of enemy waters. Submerged and relying on batteries, Harder lacks the power to run away.
Submarine underwater using its batteries goes at its maximum speed of about 8 knots. It will actually run out of all of its battery power in just 1 hour. And so you've got destroyers up above and they've got you cornered. You know, you can't just put it in full gear and go, or you won't have the power needed to get back to the surface.
You're not fast enough to get away, and all you'll do is exhaust your batteries so that if they give up, you're dead anyway.
Come about new heading of 020. All ahead 2/3 for 5 minutes.
Dealey has a plan the Japanese probably haven't considered. Using a device called a bathythermograph, he searches for a location where water temperature changes, called a thermocline. The difference in density between warm and cold layers distorts sound waves enough to deflect active sonar. Two hours after Harder is attacked, Dealey finds what he's searching for. Rising gradually from the depths, he locates warm currents about 200 feet below the surface.
It acts as a barrier to sound waves. So the sonar bounces off of the thermocline, not the submarine, and it looks like the submarine vanishes.
Now invisible to sonar, USS Harder escapes the waters of Tawi Tawi. Later that night, the sub surfaces in clear seas to transmit details about the warships they sighted. Intelligence gathered by submarines helps the Allies to track Japanese troop movements and thwarts Japan's objective to reinforce a key island in the fight for New Guinea. It also helps to tip the balance in favor of the U.S. Navy in the battle for the Philippine Sea. On June 21st, Harder and the rescued commandos reached Darwin, Australia. They outmatched 16 ships and 18 aircraft to bring the Allied operatives home. Admiral Christie awards Dealey a Navy Cross for this epic patrol.
Commander Sam Dealey's legacy to the United States Navy is one of an inspirational role model for the submarine force.
But less than 3 months after the Borneo rescue, Dealey's 6th patrol would be his last. On August 24, 1944, USS Harder is sunk by the underwater bombs it had escaped many times. The attack involved American-built USS Stewart, seized by the Japanese in Java at the beginning of the war. In a terrible twist, it seems likely that the ship to best USS Harder was an American one. Some say the toll of Dealey's high-stakes missions played a role in his end. Others believe submarines like Harder just ran out of chances.
It doesn't sound as though the way they die is from burning out. It sounds like the way they die is their luck runs out.
Dealey accelerated the campaign against the Japanese Empire by directly attacking its warships to erode its ability to conduct war. He'd never learn of his greatest tributes. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity beyond the call of duty, Dealey would posthumously receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. After the war, the American Navy would name a new class of destroyers in his honor, an ironic tribute to a destroyer killer.